Normally what I do is I'll get two venti. I go to, Starbucks and get two venti of the pipe with 2 shots in them. So black eye and both.
Oh, we got a special one for you today. Welcome to Coffee Literature Review. My name's Chris Hendon. I'm joined by Doran Pennington. We're also doing a collaboration pod today with those at Totally Dissolved, Kathie and Bronwen. We're going to bring them in just a second, but first I want to give you an introduction. You probably come across their podcast. If you haven't listened to it, Totally Dissolved, tune in anywhere you get your podcasts. Bronwen has worked at Counterculture over the years, also at Ground Control, Yes Please, and now is back to being behind the bar at Blue Bottle Coffee in Los Angeles, while Kathie is one of the lead educators for Stumptown in Los Angeles. This is an unusual episode. We are not only discussing one paper, not 2 papers, but 2 papers and an industrial report put out by World Coffee Research. Today, we're going to tell you about where the flavor wheel, the icon of the specialty coffee industry, comes from. And it's really predicated on 2 scientific articles, one published in 2016 in the Journal of Sensory Studies, and another published in the same year in the Journal of Food Science. With that, let's go over to our discussion. All righty. First things first. How was reading these?
I absolutely love talking about flavor and palate. So, the papers were dry because being scientific papers, but I love the subject. And funny enough, on my way here, I was listening to Star Talk, and that episode had Ariel Johnson, who is the flavor scientist at UC Davis. So I was listening to that podcast on my way to record this podcast.
Oh, good.
Yes.
So you're dialed in.
I'm dialed in.
Yeah. Kathie, what do you think?
I was telling Bronwen, I was like, I have to be honest with Chris. I did not read the lexicon again. I read it when it came out. I've tasted through it.
Yeah, it's fine though, because the lexicon's all contained within that. Well, more or less contained within that other paper. Also, reading through the lexicon is extremely boring. Right. That's yeah.
So does that mean that you've tasted all of these reference flavors?
Not all of them. I tasted as many as I could in we did a couple of sessions of them. And then I was also in Minnesota at the time, and we didn't have Kroger brand there. And so we had to get the next closest thing, which was just us guessing whatever the next closest thing would have been.
Any standouts from the references?
I just really did not like drinking half and half. It was really gross, just plain. That was really what I remember. It's been a while.
So, Kathie, you said you read this when it came out. So you mean when it came out, you read the paper?
The lexicon, yeah.
Was that distributed in another version aside from this entire paper?
Yeah. No, I printed it off of the SCA, I guess SCAA at the time website, and bound it and read it.
Whoa. Bound it. Jeez.
Yeah. It was for reading reference material for the training lab that I was working in at the time. So,
yeah. Well, I think people have been trying. Yeah. So I think people have been trying for a long time to have these flavor wheels because it helps. And I heard from roasters that they preferred the older flavor wheel because it would tell you in some way what went wrong. So if you tasted, one flavor, you could use it in some way.
Yes. So that's the one thing that is very noticeable on the new one is that the older one did have defects. So that's this one, it kind of just blends that into everything, so to speak.
Yeah.
Which makes it
we do have that
confusing.
Sector that's rubbery, skunky petroleum, but that's kind of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I remember the other one was it had aroma, taints, and taste faults, and I always thought taints and faults would be a really cool name for a hardcore band or a punk band.
Hell yeah.
So
well
that
also brings me to another question about, because I'm kind of recently in the coffee world. I've enjoyed coffee for a bit, but I haven't really been immersed in it so much. So this stuff is just all it's always been that way for me. But being around for the development of this, really scientific flavor wheel, did you have an understanding when it came out of how it got made and how it got put together? Or did it just kind of get bestowed upon you?
I felt like it just got bestowed. So, because I was never, World Coffee Research, I figured, they would have had to work with numerous scientists, hopefully, to help develop this in a
More scientists than tasters.
hopefully, but
By a lot.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I'm telling you that
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
more
Oh, it
scientists
is,
involved
yes.
than people tasting.
exactly, which was super interesting. Like,
Yeah.
There wasn't like a
reading-
lot of tasting
No.
involved, it seems like. So
Well, let's get into it then, because I think unfortunately or fortunately, depending on which side of it you're on, we've read it and the listener has not. And the listener should, because it is good to know where this picture came from. In order to understand where the modern SCA flavor wheel based on World Coffee Research's lexicon has come from, you actually need to read two papers. The first one was published in the Journal of Sensory Studies in, I think it was 2016. And there was a separate paper published in also 2016 in the Journal of Food Science. One of them is a collaborative from Texas A&M and Kansas State, as well as an independent company called Sensory Spectrum. And then the follow-up, which is the one that creates the picture that you're familiar with, is the product of work done at UC Davis. So I think the logical starting point here is actually to go for the work that came out of Kansas State and Texas A&M first, which is the development of the lexicon. So basically arriving at words to describe flavors and smells that come out of coffee. Let's see how we went with the design of experiment here. Okay. So Kathie, I think it's pretty fair to say that this is a pretty complicated way to back out all the different flavors that you could possibly perceive in coffee. What do you think?
yes. Definitely.
So Bronwen, am I right here that the way they did it was like they had different sets of coffees and they slowly built up a sort of a portfolio of words?
Yes. So they had 4 different sets, which was interesting. And a third of them were from Colombia.
They sure
a
were.
lot of Colombian
Yes,
coffee.
lots of Colombian. And the funny thing was, like, my note on this was commercial samples versus specialty samples. I'm just like, I'm sure they used a mix of both, because there are some coffees here from like India, Thailand, Vietnam, and from unknown origins. I don't know.
Unknown origins.
I don't even
Spooky.
know what that means.
That's like when one of our freezer bags in our lab opens up inside the freezer. That's anything.
yeah.
The approach to the sets, I think, is actually really cool, because if I were thinking about how I would set this or how I would set this experiment up, the first thing you think of is get like every coffee from every corner of the world. And their first set is like just a small, narrow range of coffees to just kind of get like some baseline language that everyone can agree on. Because it's important to note that the way that this was done was not like blind tasting and like individual marking on a sheet like silently. It was a collaborative discussion about what people were tasting. And then they went on to expand it, and then they narrowed it down back again in one of the later sets to say, okay, now that we have this like broad set of language, how specific do we need to get to be able to tell different lots of Colombian coffees apart from each other?
In terms of the materials and methods, I think the first thing that really jumps out at you here is the number of tasters involved.
Yes, I highlighted that.
So
That was interesting.
let's talk about it. The sensory panel consisted of
5 highly trained panelists from the Sensory Analysis Center, and 4 of which were female.
Yeah. So yeah, 1 male, 4 females out of Kansas State. And these people have experience, but are not experts in coffee.
They put these guys through the ringer. We've found some other things that they've had to
we're good.
taste.
Yeah. So if you carry on reading into the section where it's describing lexicon development, you'll see somewhere in here that they start to describe methodology that they've used and others have used to develop sensory lexicon for other foodstuffs, including soy sauce, the minerality of white wine, and Portuguese blood sausage. But if you keep going down,
This is not how I wanted to learn this information. I know where you're going.
The same sensory panel of 5 individuals that have had X number of hours of tasting various things have also used common flavor notes and descriptors from a previous publication in which that same sensory panel tasted dog food.
Yep.
Well, hold on.
That's not how I wanted to learn that humans taste dog food.
Oh yeah, and they've got a whole bunch of descriptors, but I'd like to give you 3 of my favorites.
He got the paper. We got the dog food paper.
I also
So I've
looked
done
it
s-
up because
Oh,
I
yeah,
had to
so-
know. I was like, these are humans tasting this dog food.
Yeah,
They are.
Well,
Yep.
Well, remember, there's what was it? The panel's 4 females and 1 good boy. So, let me give you my favorite attributes. Okay, so my first one that I strongly dislike is fibrous. So you had to assess the fibrosity, the perception of visible fibers and filaments in the product. I did not enjoy that. I did not enjoy the presence of flex. And finally, and my least favorite, because it really, you know exactly what happened here, is the attribute of wet moist, the visual perception of the product moistness. So I, in my mind, thought that they were having like little kibbles. It turns out they went to the refrigerator section. They got that good stuff, and
No.
they set it up.
I am curious how well these tasters get paid. It's probably such a gift for them to be like, oh, we're doing coffee this time.
Yeah, not soy sauce.
And it's they mentioned that it takes a month of daily sessions to establish this lexicon. So
A month of eating the dog food.
hopefully it wasn't a month of eating the dog food.
Just the
the
dog
descriptors
food.
on the dog food are a lot more limited.
Yeah, go on.
I just
Kathy,
like the
sorry.
way that they just snuck it in there real quick
know.
in this paper. It was like talking about the idea of a living lexicon, and the sentence is, this does not change the importance or need of initial lexicons. In fact, D. Don Francesco, Koppel, and Chambers actually called their
same authors.
lexicon for dog food an initial lexicon, suggesting that lexicons are not static. They just breeze right past the fact that humans
Yeah.
are tasting dog food.
We call that a shoehorn citation. That's where you got to get your H index up a tick.
I was
But-
like, what?
So,
Zoom in?
given you read the paper, did you of the dog food? You glance over the whole thing?
I didn't. I just had to know that it was humans. I just started
Oh,
at the
yeah.
top, and I was like, yep, humans, gross.
Humans done. Tick. Okay, so just for what it's worth, do you want to guess the 4 central flavors that are common to all dog foods? I'll give you 1. Barnyard.
Oh my gosh. Wow. That makes sense, I guess.
Uh-huh. All right, go on. Give me 1.
I mean, like meaty, I would assume.
Oh, meaty. We got one. Okay. All right, Bronwen. Let's hear
my
it. We've got 2
gosh.
more to go.
Grainy, I guess.
Yes. Oh, what a legendary
They're
moment.
tasters.
Yeah.
I feel like
And
Yeah.
there
fu-
has to be some sort of like I'm thinking like fish, oil, fat,
Yes!
Yeah,
Oh,
something
that's
like
it.
that.
You've done it.
Amazing.
You've done it.
Do either of you have dogs?
I do.
No, I do
Yep.
not. I
Okay,
used
see,
to.
You've perceived the aroma of dog food.
I'm sorry, I got to derail us for one more second here.
Please.
So there's this place called the Monell Institute, and it's like a part of Drexel University in Philadelphia. And they said, oh, well, we were working on cat food for a while. And the thing is that cats are obviously very picky because they're cats. So you have to create the cat food, and then you have to leave the cat with that food for an extended period of time so that it gets acclimated, smells it, thinks, oh, that's food, I can eat that all of a sudden, right? So they were developing this food, and whatever the formulation was that they arrived at, they'd given it to the cats. The bowls, were mounted as high as you can possibly imagine. And I think there was like 22 cats, and inevitably they were so vehemently repelled by this food that 10 of them died rather than eating it.
Oh my gosh.
And they didn't die from eating it. They died out of protest.
They're principled.
Wow.
Hunger
It
strike.
was
Yes,
it was
that definitely
it was
is a
too
hunger strike.
fishy.
Those were some very picky cats.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Okay, all right, let's keep moving through this here. So Bronwen, so they've
Mhm.
tasted set 1. That's a bunch of Colombian coffees. Then we've got to go to set 2, and that's the one where they've had donated coffees from all over the place.
Yes,
Is that right?
commercial samples,
Commercial samples,
multi-varietal.
yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because there's a comment in here that after they've started to include the coffees from Kenya, Sumatra, all the other places, you start to see the flavors that we associate with those coffees start to show up, right?
Correct. What stood out for me in this, like for sets 2 and 3, they used a consumer drip coffee maker and I looked up the model. It is not, my note on this was, this is not SCA Gold Cup standard. And they also were served in styrofoam cups. I'm
Yes.
like,
Ooh.
wouldn't the styrofoam cups affect their ability to kind of taste the coffee too?
Well, there was a note about that.
Yeah.
It said the sample was
Yeah.
evaluated using this
cup.
this first cup of coffee. The second was evaluated in a new cup of the same type for
Yeah.
flavor evaluation. I guess it was still a styrofoam cup.
Still styrofoam
Mhm.
though.
It is
Oh, no,
interesting.
no. It changed to a 250 milliliter double
in
walled.
set 4 though.
Right. So
is
they
when-
knew that it would have an effect on it, but they still were like, well, let's just start with the styrofoam anyway.
Chris, did this study predate your turbo shot paper?
It did.
Because they were pulling some turbo shots.
They were.
I also
I saw
noticed that.
Well, in my case, we were doing it scientifically. In their case, they had not dialed it in. Okay. Those are different.
Yeah, they stayed in here that some samples from sets 3 and 4 were also prepared on a GS3.
That's
and
cool.
that the machine took 10 to 15 seconds to prepare each
I
sample,
know.
which
I'm just like, those
doesn't
were really
sound
sour
dumb.
shots.
Were they preparing the same, like preparing the puck? Maybe? No, probably not.
there's
That,
no
that would be
chance.
really fast. That would
That would
actually
be-
be impressive.
I've
extremely
seen some
fast.
really fast Italian baristas, but this was Kansas State.
When you're
Can't.
when you're dealing with education at Stumptown in Los Angeles, is speed of puck preparation an item?
No, because a lot of times I'm working with people who've never done this before, and that is just not a priority. But that would be
Yeah,
really
okay.
impressive. I can't do 10 to 15 seconds for sure.
There's absolutely no way.
No,
I
no.
like
I
yeah.
do think I was like, maybe they were single shots and they were using a single basket, and then a faster brew time would be okay, not ideal, but
well, they did say like
Anyway.
it was like 9 grams for some of these, but it was a little hard to decouple all of it because they were more concerned with like making sure they did a good job of detailing the science of flavor descriptors rather than the coffee preparation, which of course.
So before we dig into it too much, your experience for both of you, do you think 5 people, even though they're in kind of an open discussion and able to discuss the coffees that they're tasting and what they're picking up, do you think 5 people is enough to get out everything, or do you feel like it's too small?
I think it's way too small. First of all, like you only have 1 male, 4 females, and also are all of these people white?
Yeah.
Are they all-
It's not.
Yeah.
has similar cultural
Yes,
background.
exactly.
Well, it's funny.
So-
They even actually reference that in the paper, saying that like
Yeah.
in a very specific example of some Korean sensory science, they're like, oh, we learned that we can't use a lot of the Korean stuff because there's a lot of Korean like cultural words that show up in there. So I can imagine this being a big problem with a small sample size.
Well, and I was thinking about this like comment to Doran, like right before I came here. I'm like, well, specialty coffee in the grand scheme of things is mostly either very Eurocentric or westernized palates that drink these particular types of beverages versus at origin, or most of the world still drinks Nescafe. That is still the most widely consumed preferred method of coffee, mostly around the world because it's cheap, it's delicious, and it's only in the last, I would say
Easy.
maybe 15 years where you actually have major cities at origin where a lot of the good coffees are also staying in the country of origin. So, I mean, kind of makes sense, but also lots of metropolitan cities in Asia are, having specialty coffee. China,
Well,
for example, lots of
what do
Yunnan
you-
coffee coming out.
What do you
Yeah.
predict would be the outcome of having? Imagine they did this study with 100 people, with 20 people from different continents each. What do you think would be added or modified about this flavor wheel?
I think there would be a lot more of the kind of like the fruity, like the
Oh, really? You
fruity
think fruity?
flavors. I think there would definitely be a vaster, I think, descriptor of different fruits and spices.
Does tomato count as a fruit?
Yes, it is a fruit, Chris.
All right. Well, I just checked.
For sure a fruit.
I also feel like some of the flavors that are maybe in the portion that's connected to like negative flavors would be encouraged to move away from there, because it's something that we're learning and kind of talking about more with the new coffee value assessment form, is that there are flavors that in westernized coffee, like Western palette of coffee, are not considered, they're considered defects or not considered defects in other cultures.
Okay, so you could see maybe like more sectors of the wheel.
Well, let's just finish up on this first paper real quick, because you're really touching on exactly what they were saying. As that they started out with this really broad portfolio of flavors, and they had to narrow it down. And they did some sorting, and they asked at some point, I think they even asked some coffee professionals at Kansas State to actually provide some opinion. Right? They narrowed it down a little bit. I want to point out a couple of things. So, like the paper, basically, after they've done all this, taste coffee, get various people to add in flavors, subtract flavors, and inevitably arrive at the standard preparation methods for each reference flavor, so that you can then prepare it and understand what that flavor means when you say that word. This is the smell or taste that we're talking about. But I find really interesting is that my biggest peeve on the flavor wheel is the fact that vanilla and vanillin are both there.
Yes.
And it's like, but then reading this paper, you'd think, oh, I know what happened. At some point, someone deep, like group 4, said, oh, hey, we got to put in vanillin because that's this thing. Nope. Vanilla and vanillin have survived since round 1. This is insane. Totally unjustifiable. Anyway.
And to be clear, that's like the difference between natural vanilla bean and synthetic vanilla. But
I think it's interesting that vanilla is in the description of vanillin. It says an extremely sweet, non-natural aromatic often associated with vanilla for vanillin.
So the rest of this first paper is all the different preparation. It's pages and pages. It's also what's in the World Coffee Research website. So if you want to not read the science behind it, just get straight to the standard preparations, what you can do is go to WCR, download the PDF in various different languages, and hopefully you'll have access to the ingredients that will then give you the preparation method and their intensity of aroma and taste. Great.
So I feel like the last important thing to say about this first paper is that they have in figure 1 principal component analysis plot, where they're just demonstrating that the lexicon that they've developed is effectively able to differentiate coffees. And it's able to differentiate coffees that are really different, which is obviously good, but it's also able to differentiate coffees that are very similar but slightly different in like their processing method or the microclimate where they're from. So you can see that there's a spread of all of these different specific coffee samples based on the flavor, aroma, and aftertaste using the vocabulary that they've developed. So that's a win for the model. That shows that you have enough of a vocabulary to distinguish between different things. And then they also show in figure 2 this tree plot. It looks like a tree because that's what they call it. And that's just showing you that these vocabulary words kind of go from least specific to most specific. So, bitter is a really common flavor, so it's close to the base. Black tea is a really common flavor, so it's close to the base. But then if you want to distinguish, like vanilla and vanillin are really far out because those are really specific flavors. So that's kind of what is going to eventually, in the next paper, which describes the flavor wheel, give rise to those like big sectors at the base and then those really specific flavors kind of on the outside. But importantly, there's no real like useful thing that you could just distribute to a coffee shop or show to someone tasting coffee and have them make sense of it. It's all very complicated at this point. Like all of the words are there, but it's not really in a usable form.
On to paper 2.
I would kind of have expected that there would be some kind of more collaborative approach to making the vocabulary into a tool, like a visual tool, but there is no author that is on both papers. So this is almost entirely separate.
What you'll note is that Emma Sage
Yes.
here is also acknowledged in the previous paper. So Emma Sage at the time was working for the SCA and is now working for the CQI. Okay, so what do they do here?
What do they not do?
I can tell you what they did not do. Not a single person collected data of drinking coffee.
Exactly.
Yes,
that
nobody
was so
drank coffee.
interesting. I'm just like, wait, I had to reread that line. The entire process was online and remote. I'm like, what the hell?
Yeah.
Pre-COVID, they were early on this.
I also feel like the way that they said it, I don't remember where it's at in here, but it's just like, of course, like nobody tasted coffee. We didn't need to taste coffee. The way that they said it was just like,
That was just
why
funny.
would that be an important thing?
I do understand the idea though, which is that you have all of these words that describe flavors, and all you're asking the people to do, and these are people that are in some way trained to taste things, not necessarily coffee, but things. You're asking them is of these flavors, which ones go together, which ones are associated with each other. So that's how you get lime, lemon, orange to end up together close on the wheel that gets developed out of this paper.
Let's focus for a second on the current embodiment of the flavor wheel that we're all very familiar with. There's 3 tiers to the flavor wheel. There's the inner ring, which has the sort of the mega groups of fruity and other spices, sweet, etc. Then there's the sort of the middle ring, which has, I'd say, umbrella categories like within fruity, there are berries. Okay, so then it's the subcategory of berries. And then in the outermost area of those berries, you have different types of berries. The binning exercise did not involve the innermost ring. It involved the middle ring and the outer ring.
Mm-hmm.
That's super, super important, right? Because think about what that means from a statistical perspective. If I asked you, which category should I put the following flavors in? Should I put dark green and vegetative under the umbrella of other fruit? Or should I put it dark green and vegetative under the umbrella of green and vegetative? And why so I criticized him at the time for this, and I still maintain this is a valid criticism, is that if 100% of participants doing this exercise identify green and vegetative as needing to go in green and vegetative, then that instills artificial confidence in their ability to respond or delineate or differentiate between flavors that are much, much more subtle. In other words, if you have a really good data point that says, hey, look, all of our people can do this for sure, that gives you a lot more confidence when they come to split vanilla and vanillin.
Yeah, another really interesting nuance of this paper is that the first batch of panelists are just the online people. They're not required to be in the coffee world or to be trained in tasting coffee. They're just kind of people that taste things. But then there's also a batch of 43 people that are in the coffee industry. Not necessarily like Q graders or anything, but just people that are used to tasting coffee all the time. And if you look at figure 2, they have this plot which shows the difference in perception of flavors, not perception by tasting, but perception by thinking about them, between the coffee people and the general panelists. And some of them are really far apart.
Yeah.
They're
like
so
you can
far
see
apart.
that, for example, the idea of where you put black tea is really different between people that are in the coffee world and people that are not in the coffee world.
Yeah.
The idea of where you put apple is
apple.
really different. Blueberry is really different.
Yeah.
So there are some that
Chamomile.
are very close, but some that people in coffee have a specific idea of what that flavor is that doesn't necessarily match maybe more of like a general public idea of what that flavor is. And I think that gets to a challenge in communicating sensory notes in coffee, because you experience it all the time where someone's like, well, this bag said it's supposed to taste like bubble gum and it tastes like coffee. And you're like, no, but if you really think about it, so it's like,
Mhm.
this is kind of hinting at that problem that we get when we try and take flavors that are either on the wheel or tasting notes supplied by a roaster. Whenever you try and translate them from a coffee audience to a general public, a lot of the time the perception is not necessarily aligned between the two.
Yeah, there's like a translation issue.
Yeah, and actually I hadn't really appreciated how interesting this line actually is, but figure 2 here highlights a couple that are really far apart. And these are surprisingly the ones that actually I also struggle when I'm trying to teach people like flavors, like, oh, taste this thing. Don't you taste chamomile? And they're like, no. Yeah, okay, well, but so the ones that are really problematic are apple, as Doran mentioned, acetic acid. Isn't that weird?
Yeah, that
Acetic
is so
acid is
weird.
literally vinegar, and
And
we
almond.
almond,
Almond
yeah, and
is
the other
so
one
far.
and floral, and it's like okay. So when you look at this, and the industry has an opinion one way, and all the consumers who are miscellaneous people who are just binning this have the totally on the other end of the spectrum. There's something in there. So we got to do better as an industry. If that means, if we're using words that our consumers aren't understanding, the lexicon, as they say, is a living lexicon. Well, maybe it needs another life. Maybe it needs a second life. Kathie, what are your thoughts on it?
I was just kind of thinking about that actually earlier as I was like getting ready to, cleaning up from my class, just kind of thinking about these papers, that if it's a living document, we haven't really seen any updates on it. And I do feel like it needs some. And I think that the way that processing coffee has changed so much, there are flavors that are sort of being created in coffee. I guess also some of this is going to come down to like, how are we considering, and we don't need to talk about any other thoughts about this part, because I think it's a whole tangent. But
hey, take me down any road you want. I'm ready. Let's roll.
Co-fermented coffees and the flavors that those are creating. I think we're adding new flavors into coffees that aren't on here. And yeah, I think we need, like, if it's a living thing, I think we need to be updating it, and not, on a whim and like, oh, co-ferment coffees are popular right now, let's add all these flavors that could potentially be added. But I do think it's been long enough that there should be some updates to it of things that have come up.
I think the big challenge with co-ferments is that the intensity is so much different from anything that you get out of like a washed coffee, that it really, really dominates. Even when it's kind of modest, the intensity is unlike anything you've ever experienced. And so how do you compare like the blueberry that you get or the pineapple that you get from a natural to the pineapple that you get from a co-ferment? I mean, they're different pineapples.
Yeah.
How do you talk about that with someone that's walking into a coffee shop? I think that's a big challenge.
That'll require another flavor wheel.
But do either of you use the flavor wheel when you're trying to describe flavors? Like, do you stick to it? Do you stick to the flavors that are on the wheel?
I do, just for for basic purposes, because so I'm part of a monthly kind of blind coffee panel that Kumquat uses to kind of send their subscription coffees to their clientele. And so a month before they send those out, they send us samples, like a set of 3 to 4 samples of coffees that they're considering. And so I usually reference that because the panel is a mix of coffee professionals and like common people, like non-industry folk. And so for me, it's just an easy way to have some common language and common vocabulary for the way that they're trying to present to their customers.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Which I think is super helpful.
Yeah.
I would say that I don't so much.
What's your go-to flavor note that's not on the wheel?
I mean, I feel like it's like candies that like, it reminds me of a type of candy, So like, I'm not going to be like, oh, this tastes like a peach. It tastes like a peach ring, because it's like more of like a peach candy flavor. Yeah. And so I think when I wander away from those flavors, it tends to be like a fruit that isn't the fruit version. It's an artificial version of it, because it's not a good comparison.
I've often used the comparison of like a jam to like a fresh fruit. They have the same character, but they come out differently. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I guess maybe like the thing would be a qualifier to the flavor. So it's not peach, it's grilled peach, or it's like peach jam or peach candy. Yeah.
The big use of the flavor wheel for us is we have a big printout of it in the coffee lab, and we often get people tasting coffee that have never really like tasted coffee. Mm-hmm. They just drink it, and we're like, what does this taste like to you? And they're like, coffee? You can see their gears turning, and they're like, I don't know what it tastes like. And it's really cool to just say like, we have the flavor wheel over there, go look at it. and they'll take a sip when they look at it and they're like, oh, I do get a little bit of like maple syrup. You know, like it's really easy for people that are not used to tasting coffee to look at that list of words and then be able to find their way around it and say like, oh, this is like pointing me in this direction.
When you're teaching people how to taste coffee for the first time and you have the flavor wheel in front of you, how do you help them navigate it?
I usually tell people to like focus more on the center first, where it's more simplified, and just kind of think about the coffee in terms of sweet and fruity and floral and like just the very basic descriptor. And then if they feel like they could break that down further, there are some suggestions beyond that. And like, okay, so it tastes sweet, but what kind of sweetness? Or it tastes fruity, what kind of fruit? And I feel like that it's more of like suggestions to sort of help direct them to kind of access some sort of memory of that thing to try and compare it to what they're tasting now.
Bronwen, is that you do the same thing?
I do something really similar, and I kind of break it down to where I'm like, okay, you're tasting coffee. Does this taste sweet, sour, bitter? You know, kind of going towards like what they're actually tasting, because that's really what you can actually taste. And then the rest of it are, you know, you have to incorporate your sense of smell, right? Because most flavors are, you have to incorporate both your taste receptors as well as your smell, your olfactory senses. So you can't really distinguish anything unless you're kind of combining both. So I'm like, okay, great. Like what type of sweet and what type of bitter, and kind of asking them to recall like, well, think about what you've been eating or something that's familiar to you when you're tasting this thing. And then going from there, because sometimes just looking at that wheel can be very overwhelming, or especially like in a cupping, you get very intimidated if it's like your first time and then you see all of these people starting to like throw out these terms and you're just like, I'm just tasting coffee. So kind of making it less intimidating for them by engaging them and kind of asking them, well, what do you think, what was familiar to you when you're looking at this and tasting this at the same time?
That makes it seem like the coffee wheel or the flavor wheel is really meeting the challenge of what it was designed for.
Yeah.
If you can be really new to coffee and just work your way from the middle out and find your way to a specific flavor that otherwise would have been extremely difficult for you to come up with, I think that means that the flavor wheel is amazing and that it's like doing what it needs to do. Do you think that there are deficiencies that you notice whenever you're using that as a guide? Like things that you feel that it is unequipped to do?
For me, just having that like culture, like the bridging the various cultures, I think that's the biggest thing, is that like the terminology is more common to a westernized or Eurocentric palate. Like that's the biggest thing. But to your point, Doran, the goal, like in the paper, the goal of the project was to organize given coffee flavor descriptors in such a way that simplifies and standardizes the process. It definitely has met that goal, but the detailed terms definitely need to be fleshed out as because this is a living lexicon.
Let me talk briefly about their so-called dendrogram. Okay, so this is kind of getting towards how you end up at the wheel, but some actual high fidelity information about the wheel that perhaps maybe you've noticed but didn't really appreciate where it came from. So let's start with this dendrogram. So Doran previously described in the other paper a tree which grew upwards and branched outwards. A dendrogram is sort of like a liquid rolling down a hill and finding different places that it can fall. And basically, at the top of the dendrogram, it assumes that all flavors are equal. And as you start to progress down the dendrogram, what you're branching at is the statistical difference between those flavors. So if there's a high up branch, the higher up the branch, the more different. You're confident those are very different. And so as a result, you're going to find that those mega categories of things like spices and sweet and fruit, that sort of thing, those branch early. That's where those big category names come from, is that the branches actually are selected by the sorting activity. So that later on you can come back and assign the inner wheels words. So fine. So there's some pretty obvious branches way up high, like pretty far up high. And they start to put colors from that initial series of big branches so that you can then follow with your eye as they trickle down. And inevitably, you'll find that at the very, very bottom, there's going to be some very close together branches. So they branch. They're statistically significant, but they are right down there at the very bottom. And I'm trying to resolve a couple of them.
Raspberry, blackberry, really close.
That's a good one.
Lemon lime.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then,
Yeah.
so the reason I'm struggling here is this figure sucks. This is one of the worst figures. It is a screenshot where they left the mouse over the chart and it included
Yes.
the little micro thing. What's happening here?
I'm trying to read the horizontal axis in this like blurry font.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
It's
you
impossible
can't.
to
It's
know.
Pretty
But they left it and
impossible.
it says chart area on the figure.
I know, which I found so funny. And also, so on this too, it's like the way they go from green vegetated to sour fermented is that very specific, like because green vegetative is close to floral statistically on. Is that how they line this all up too?
The green and vegetative branch branched off the top really, really fast. So you can see it's like the very first branch that springs off and goes left.
Yeah.
And so all the other flavors at that moment are still all together. So actually what it's saying is that green and vegetative is far away from all those other flavors. I don't know did they say it in this paper? Maybe they did. That on the outermost regions of the flavor wheel, you'll note that the spacing between certain words on the flavor wheel or certain panels is variable. So for example, I'm looking at the flavor wheel now, and I encourage you to get one up in front of you. You'll see that the space between peanuts on the left side and clove, that gap is bigger than the space between clove and cinnamon. That gap relates to the position of the branch on the dendrogram. And so the different gap sizes around the wheel tell you how close or far apart different things were in the dendrogram. So that's nice, right? Because it does now capture that one thing that we were just talking about, which is that green and vegetative down the bottom there, that beanie is pretty far away from paper musty, and simultaneously olive oil is pretty far away from alcohol fermented. And that's a big gap on the inner ring. And so that was the best way they could capture that high up branch from green and vegetative. In other words, green flavors are out on an island. That's the executive summary.
I feel like that could have visually been a little bit better.
Yeah.
Well,
and also that's probably under roasted coffee.
What else? Kathie, tell me what else.
I was just thinking about the fact that, like, so this is arranged in a specific way based on all of this tasting and putting together, pairing things and clustering things. I'm curious of your thoughts on this versus the old flavor wheel, where they were organized by, the aromatics were arranged by molecular weight.
Yeah. Well, so we didn't talk about
because
this.
that's not really something that people know by looking at it. Like, oh yes, molecular weight. I see.
Yes. Yes. Getting heavier. No, so we didn't talk about it in the previous paper, but in the previous paper, the only reason that those acids are there in the way that they're presented is because someone came in at some point and goes, well, we got to add the acids at this level of fidelity. Otherwise they wouldn't have been reflected as at that level of fidelity of I don't know, acetic acid, isovaleric acid, and so on.
Which is, by the way, entirely useless if you're just someone who is tasting coffee. Like, I cannot tell you what those different specific acids taste like. I have no idea. Like, there's no way to reference that. No one knows, oh, yes, this is malic acid versus acetic acid. Like,
well, okay, hold on. No. Bronwen, if
Yes.
you want to tell someone to taste malic acid, what are you going to tell them to taste?
I'm going to have them taste apple.
Apples.
But
then
I
it
don't
should-
know which one, but which part of that crispness of it, that crispness of an apple, that's like the malic acid.
Yeah.
But obviously, different apples, different varieties of apples have different tastes too. So
We need a whole apple flavor wheel.
then it should
Yes.
just be apple.
Yeah. Okay, Kathie, isovaleric acid, what are you going to get people to taste?
I don't know.
Exactly. This is my point.
No, you don't. There's not. You don't need to. You don't need to know it. The point is, the World Coffee Research Lexicon is a living document. That's the point. Okay. All right, we're going for an 8 o'clock delight here, where you get to add, you get to delete something, you get to add something. All right, Doran, go.
I delete the chemical names of the acids. Those are obliterated and gone. If you want to describe them, use like something that anyone would actually know. If I were to add something, I often include a preparation. So I won't say like peanut. I'll say like honey roasted peanut. I won't say mango. I'll say like dried mango, like something that is a little more specific. Which obviously the wheel is a jumping off point, but I think what might be interesting is if they had some kind of way to codify that, like jamminess or
like
freshness.
A qualifiers section.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
exactly
All
what
right,
I
so
was
you're
gonna
saying
say.
well, hold on. Let me float an idea at you. You're saying like the counterculture wheel at the bottom, you could have a panel where it's like fresh version or synthetic version.
Yeah. Something that clues people into that being allowed, I think makes it a lot more clear that that's something that you're going to pick up.
Okay, so all sourness is off the wheel according to Doran, gone. And in addition, we're going to have exactly all the flavors in a completely new wheel with different qualifiers. Okay, good. All right, Kathie, go. Delete one, add one.
I don't really have a good reason for
No, this is dictatorship. You get to delete and add.
I don't like the word animalic. It makes me uncomfortable.
Boom, gone.
So I would like to delete it for that reason. And then I think that I would add maybe a different word to replace it because I do think it's necessary. But I feel like it's...
Barnyard?
Barnyard is the word.
Musky.
So, yeah. I mean, barnyard is used in other things too, like whiskey. Yeah.
We're back. Bronwen.
I wouldn't delete anything, but I would add like body and like the old flavor wheel kind of had that, and the counterculture flavor wheel does have that off to the side. Like, yeah, how is this sitting on your palate?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. So no deleting.
No deleting. I would just add things.
Okay. Well, in that case, we don't have that much work to do. Just one substitution. I'll make a call, and Kathie, it's done. It's done.
What's yours?
Look, vanilla or vanilla.
Vanillin.
Doran deleted vanillin already, so that's gone. My addition here would be I would like to see tomato reflected there. I also would like to see a category called Freaky Deaky, which is the catch-all for all those co-ferments and everything else that you've talked about.
I do think in general the whole sweet category does need a lot of work.
Okay, yeah, okay. So sweet.
So I'm with you. I mean, what's the difference between sweet, overall sweet aromatics?
All right. We gotta go. We've done this. So executive summary is what? Summarize it for us.
The flavor wheel is a great start. The new updated flavor wheel is a great start to update a living lexicon, but it needs to live.
Yeah, let it live. I think it's a helpful tool if used in a variety of ways, but I feel like there was probably some intention about how it was meant to be used and maybe isn't happening quite that way. And probably could have used a little bit more input from more tasters.
Yeah, I feel like the summary is that there is a secret tribunal of 5 people who have exerted their will over the coffee industry in ways previously unimaginable.
Yeah, these 4 women and 1 man.
Yeah.
These 4 people, if we ever find out you'll never find them though. You'll never find them because evidently they spend all of their life just sticking things in their mouth and in their nose. So, by the way, every paper, it says the same, like they act like, oh, we won't tell you who it is, but it says the same panel, and the number of hours that they practiced is going up, but it's not going up as much as they say they've been training. That's like me when I'm reporting back to my wife, like, yes, I had a salad for lunch. It's like, look, we can tell that's not true. Okay. There's literally numbers to support that. All right. We've done it. We've said it all. Thank you both. It's been a delight.
All right. Thanks, guys.
So fun.